So the first question is that when we talk about the Prophet ﷺ as, well, let me read this question. When we talk about the Prophet ﷺ as someone who rose above enmity and insult, what do we do about those exceptions? And how do we study those exceptions? So particularly this question mentions Ka'b ibn Ashraf. Actually, that's sort of the point of the research, was that you start off from this premise, or based on this premise, that this is who the Messenger ﷺ always was. Then you can move on to the incidents and the exceptions. When you look at those incidents where the Prophet ﷺ, seemed to order the assassination of someone who showed him enmity or showed him insult, there's always something else to it, and that's the idea here, right? So when we talk about Ka'b ibn Ashraf, we talk about a man who not only insulted the Messenger ﷺ, but also was a warmonger, also someone that brought much harm to the Messenger ﷺ. And we do plan, inshallah, to actually address those incidents in quite some detail. But the point is that there are different levels of insult. Clearly, the Messenger ﷺ dealt with things with grace, and justice is to be shown in some of these situations. But the Messenger ﷺ consistently opted for mercy. So there's a question here: how do you explain the situation of Banu Qurayza? Now, when we talk about Banu Qurayza, first of all, there are a few things about Banu Qurayza. Number one, it's not fair to make that the normal interaction or the basis for how the Prophet ﷺ normally interacted with the Jews of Medina. There were several tribes of Jews in Medina, and the Messenger ﷺ had a good relationship with them. Banu Qurayza is an incident, or is a situation when you have three tribes actually: Banu Qurayza, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qaynuqa'. But particularly in the case of Khandaq, Banu Qurayza, who were accused of treason, right, for plotting with the enemies of the Prophet ﷺ and the enemies of the state, right, to have the Messenger ﷺ and the Muslims massacred. So you have an outside enemy attacking Medina, and you have a group of people that conspire with those that are coming from the outside, to harm the Muslims, inside the state. So this was a violation, not just from a religious perspective. It was also a violation of the constitution and the pact that the Messenger ﷺ had with all of the non-Muslim tribes in Medina, including the Jewish tribes. Not all the Jewish tribes violated that constitution or that pact, but in this situation you had a clear violation. Now, let's say that a person wants to argue that no, they did not violate anything, and a person wants to use Banu Qurayza to say that the Prophet ﷺ had it out for the Jews. Well, how do you explain the normal situation, the normal ties that the Messenger ﷺ had with so many other Jews? So whether or not you argue this from a Muslim perspective or a non-Muslim perspective, you cannot make this the basis for how the Messenger ﷺ dealt with Jews. Now, with that being said, Banu Qurayza were dealt with from an Islamic perspective. Their punishment was directly taken from the Torah. So the judgment was actually passed against them in accordance with the laws of the Torah, and this was something that the Prophet ﷺ ordained, legal pluralism, that when non-Muslims lived under Muslims, particularly the people of the book, they were to be judged by their own scholars, and they were to be judged by their own texts, all right, when it came to religious things. So the crime of treason was applied. With that being said, another discussion that's important to have is the amount of people that were killed. The 600, 700 number that comes up with those that were killed in Banu Qurayza is not the most authentic portrayal. So it's somewhere probably around 150 to 200 people. Some may even say even less based on the sources of the men that were killed in Banu Qurayza. So that's actually something which we have a future research paper. Again, Sheikh Muhammad al-Shinawi and myself are working on a paper on the relationship with the Prophet ﷺ and the Jews of Medina. And that'll sort of, just like we did with this paper, we always want to start off, before we analyze exceptions, we always want to start off with putting out the norm, that this is how the Prophet ﷺ normally dealt with people, to show, that Muslims and Jews did indeed, as in many parts of history, enjoyed good relationships, and the Prophet ﷺ enjoyed a good relationship with many of the Jews. So it would be anti-Semitic on one hand, or it'd be anti-Jewish and bigoted to say that the Jews were inherently treacherous, and that's why the incident of Banu Qurayza happened. And it would also be, Islamophobic rhetoric or improper to say that the Muslims inherently had it out for the Jews and that the Prophet ﷺ was always after the Jews. So both of these are extreme arguments. So you have to analyze these incidents first and foremost by setting a premise, which is what we did with this paper, inshallah. So look out for that publication, inshallah, coming soon. All right. I think the broadcast is fine on my end, so I don't see that it keeps on getting interrupted from my end. Abu Abbad, some people disregard the colonial project argument as mere conspiracy theory. What is an effective response to that sense of resistance to the notion of propaganda for imperial gains? Some people disregard the colonial project argument as mere conspiracy theory. What is an effective response to that sense of resistance to the notion of propaganda for imperial gains? I think that it's undeniable. The colonial project is undeniable. This is not just something that the British employed when they conquered the Muslim territories. It's something that the British employed against any disadvantaged people or any people that were being conquered or oppressed. There's nothing that forms a more stable sense of resistance than a cultural resistance, and that cultural resistance is often deeply embedded within a religious tradition. And so resistance to imperialism and to colonialism often came through an Islamic form of resisting colonialism and occupation imperialism, especially when we're talking even early in the 20th century. On the other hand, there was much to gain to implant certain ideas internally within these Muslim countries and within these Muslim communities of a form of Islam that would be more friendly to colonialism. So, as some history scholars historians would point out, that two games were played basically within the imperial project, or for imperial gains. Internally, it's to portray, it's to formulate a form of religion or cultural identity that does not resist occupation or imperialism or colonialism. Externally, the justification for imperialism and for colonialism is to portray the conquered as being barbaric, inherently barbaric, and a threat to the world. And therefore, they cannot but be contained and dealt with in an inhumane fashion because they are not actually human. Right? They're not like decent, civilized human beings. So it can be dismissed as conspiracy theory, but I think that there's much to that. There's much to gain by portraying the Muslims in such a fashion, and by portraying Islam as inherently violent. And the only way that part of the world can be dealt with is not diplomacy, but by carpet bombings and occupation. So I think that it's hard to argue against that. But with everything going on right now politically, it's hard to distinguish truth from falsehood a lot on these things. So, all right. But the idea here, the colonial project, is put forth by non-Muslim academics as well as Muslim academics. Okay, so it's not just Facebook, but actually non-Muslim academics putting out this time. All right. Okay, this question is not related to the resource or to the research. So we live in a time where Muslims are constantly demonized in the U.S. However, I sincerely wonder if Muslims would be as concerned if it was some other group that was demonized. President Obama and many others before him had been deporting Mexicans for decades, and Muslims have never mentioned these tragedies in their lectures, khutbas, etc. Similar for blacks. What right do we have to criticize others who attack us when we will not stand up for them? If I'm not mistaken, the Prophet ﷺ did charity and other humanitarian work for pagans for 40 years before preaching during his prophethood. If Muslims want the respect and defense from others, shouldn't we have to earn it as well? There are two questions there. They're not really related to the research, so I'll just give you quick answers. Number one, many of the people that are criticizing Donald Trump's administration. We're also criticizing Obama's administration. I'm one of them. I think that the blatant nature of this and the danger of this time forces us to organize in a certain way and forces us to come out in a certain way. But I agree with you. I'm not trying to dismiss your question, which is why I read it and I'm answering it quickly. I agree with you that it's important for us to be there for other communities, inshallah ta'ala, not just so they can be there for us, but because that's who we are. So it's not just that we should earn their support by being there for them, it's just who we are. All right. MashaAllah. All right, Somalia. What's an effective response to accusations about apostasy law in Islam? So that's one of also some research that we're doing right now, inshallah ta'ala, as to formulating a proper or a comprehensive, thorough response with Dr. Hatim al-Hajj and Dr. Jonathan Brown as well, inshallah ta'ala, on the question of apostasy. I think that the paper that we put out with Sister Tasneem al-Qiq, which she will be doing a Q&A about religious minorities, inshallah, answered some of those questions. One of those, one answer which is very important is that the whole concept of citizenship, which she mentions in her paper thoroughly, and this is again according to non-Muslim academics, the whole concept of citizenship in the past was not in accordance with the nation state, but it was more so with your religious identity than anything else. So when apostasy was equivalent to a form of treason, which in many ways it was at the time, then it was dealt with in a certain way. When apostasy is and this is something that Dr. Hatim argues, that apostasy is, or the punishment for apostasy is not a had, it's actually in the ta'deed, it's actually something that's in the judgment of the court, so the implications of that apostasy. But I think that there is debate about what it means, and we should not come up with a response just to appease, but we should actually, and this is our goal at Yaqeen, is to actually study these issues for what they are, and to provide comprehensive understandings of both classical positions and present-day implementation. So what that meant classically, and I do believe this, and I say this all the time, that Islam has always, if you look at the time periods that it was in, Islam, when it came to the ethics of war, when it came to humanitarianism, when it came to showing mercy to captives, to foes, to different nation states, Islam has always been at the forefront of setting a moral standard for the world. And that's true in the 7th century, and it should be true today as well. So the effective response, first and foremost, just is one that we need to formulate comprehensively. We can't just gloss over these issues or give 1 or 2 sentence answers. But it's important to point out what citizenship truly entailed. The punishment for treason in the United States is a capital punishment, right? So at what points did apostasy in the classical era actually equal to a form of treason? So that's something to be discovered, inshallah ta'ala, to be looked into. And again, we have both Dr. Hatim, inshallah ta'ala, as well as Dr. Brown working on something in that regard, inshallah. If the Muslim state is being threatened by people trying to secede, is it Islamically just to suppress that revolt, even if it causes killing and suppression? That's a highly theoretical question. So Azam is asking, if the Muslim state is being threatened by people trying to secede, is it Islamically just to suppress that revolt, even if it causes killing and suppression? That depends highly on the situation. I think that when we talk about what a Muslim state is and what a threat actually entails, what that secession entails. So is it a nation state where you have another nation state that's trying to form? Because surely that's not the equivalent of khilafah existing, a righteous khilafah and someone trying to secede out of a righteous khilafah. What is the definition there of that secession? So generally speaking, when we talk about Islam and Islamic ethics and politics, so I'll give an answer which I hope, inshallah ta'ala, just in light of the fact that these details are very important. They're highly theoretical. When we talk about the Muslims and we talk about what our political ethics entail, is Islam pro-stability, and at what expense is Islam pro-stability? So looking throughout our Quran and Sunnah, Islam does not believe, or the Prophet ﷺ was sure to put out this idea that the people are responsible to the ruler and the ruler is accountable to the people. So they're both accountable to each other. There are different parties. There are inherent checks and balances that exist within the political ethics of Islam. So, what constitutes disobedience or revolution, and what constitutes a permissible way or a praiseworthy way? Kalimatu haqq 'inda sultanin ja'ir, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, the greatest form of jihad is to speak a word of truth to an unjust ruler. What is loyal opposition, and what is detrimental to the people and to the state? So all of those things are considered, and this is the importance of shura. Realize that I tell people this all the time, that when even the Sahaba themselves had to take shura to formulate responses to unique situations. So Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, لو كان نبيا من بعدي لكان عمر, if there was to be a prophet after me, it would have been Umar. When he was faced with these unique situations, he would often take Ali radiyallahu ta'ala anhu and Salman and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and these great companions into confidence and ask them. And he would often find disagreement amongst them as to how to deal with the situation. An example of that is when Hurmuzan, the ruler of Persia, was brought to the Muslim territories. This is not to venture too far off, but it actually relates to our research. And he was going to be executed. He was at war with the Muslims. He was going to be executed. And he asked Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu for a glass of water. And when Umar gave him the glass of water, he said, "Do you promise me that I'm safe until I finish this glass of water?" Okay, I'm going to take a sip of this. Alright, alhamdulillah. That's coffee, not water. But he said, "Do you promise me that I'm safe until I finish this glass of water?" So Umar radiallahu anhu told him yes. So when Umar told him that, he broke the glass of water. And Umar was stuck. He didn't know what to do. So Umar radiallahu anhu consulted the companions, Ali and Ibn Auf and others. Do I have to fulfill this promise to him or not? I mean, he clearly just pulled one on me. And they differed. Some of them said you have to honor the oath. Some of them said you don't. And Umar radiallahu anhu opted to honor that promise. And when he did that, Hurmuzan was told basically he's free to go because he was given a promise of safety until he finishes drinking that glass of water, which he never did. And when he did that, Hurmuzan said, "Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." So he actually took shahada. So this is one of the narrations that comes down to us. And the point to illustrate here is that you're going to have different responses to different issues, even from the companions as they were dealing with situations. How did they deal with the fitna? Right? There were different responses. Can we really say that Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Zubayr, may Allah be pleased with them both, that either one of them was wrong in their approach? Right? Abdullah ibn Umar deciding silence, Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu ta'ala anhu taking a much more dramatic approach, becoming essentially a khalifa of the Haramain. And there were two khilafas essentially that existed with Ibn Zubayr radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Abdul Malik ibn Marwan rahimahullah for some time. There were actually two subsequent khilafas. So all of these are highly hypothetical, and they require sound advice from the scholarly bodies of the time. Alright. Awesome. How do we implement the kind of mercy that the Prophet ﷺ showed in our lives, at our level? So Hisham asks, how do we implement this kind of mercy that the Prophet ﷺ showed in our own lives? Well, surely if the Prophet ﷺ dealt with his enemies in such a way, then we can deal with those that harm us or those that insult us with the same grace that the Messenger ﷺ dealt with. I'm thinking, I believe it was Dr. A'ad al-Qarni who mentioned that if we were to deal with our loved ones the way the Prophet ﷺ dealt with his enemies, then we would be we'd be well off as an ummah. So if we showed the same level of grace to our loved ones that the Prophet ﷺ showed with his enemies, then we would do well. But we are harsher on our loved ones than the Prophet ﷺ was on his enemies, on his worst enemies. So I think we try to implement that same level of grace. One of the poems about the Prophet ﷺ that was said in Am al-Wufud, in the year of the delegation, the name of the companion escapes me. Maybe someone can give it to me. I know he's al-Ja'di. But anyway, he said about the Prophet ﷺ, لا خير في حلم إذا لم يكن له بوادر تحمي صفوه أن يكدر. He said that there is no good in showing forbearance or compassion that the Prophet ﷺ showed if you don't have the proper protocols, so that your compassion and your forbearance is not one that puts your community at danger, right? So you have to also have the strategy with your compassion and the strategy with your love, especially when you're talking about a person that's in a position of authority. When are you putting your community in harm's way, or when are you putting yourself in harm's way? There's a fine line between being gracious and being naive. So he praised the Prophet ﷺ's hilm, his forbearance. That the Prophet ﷺ had certain, he knew when to get angry, he knew when to show forbearance, and though he was loving and graceful ﷺ, he didn't put his community in harm's way due to his grace and due to his mercy. On the other hand, when you talk about jahl, he says وَلَا خَيْرَ فِي جَهْلٍ, and there's no good in anger. And actually, interestingly enough, jahl in Arabic poetry was the word used to describe anger. Jahl means ignorance, but in Arabic poetry, jahl actually refers to anger. Where the prophets, where he describes the Prophet ﷺ that there's no good in anger if a person doesn't know when to stop. إِذَا مَا أُورِدَ الْأَمْرَ أَصْدَرَ. He doesn't know when to put it to a stop. So you have to show anger in measured proportions at time for the sake of justice. But if your anger is nafsi or it's for ego, then you're going to go too far and you're going to transgress. So a person has to know when to check their anger as well, and that's the description of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All right, this is a really good question. KL Whiteman, I'm a revert. May Allah bless you and keep you firm. I find that there are a lot of Muslims that when they are yelled at in the street, they deal with the situation in the same manner, yelling back. When I asked about this, I was told as Muslims we cannot let people get away with insults, that we should fight back. Loaded question. I believe that there is a balance to be struck here, and we see it with the Messenger ﷺ as well, that sometimes the Prophet ﷺ responded to insult in like manner, not becoming foul, not becoming filthy, but essentially showing a stance of dignity and a refusal to be bullied. The problem in a climate where it is normalized to insult Muslims or to discriminate against Muslims, the problem with letting that go is that you enable that person to do it again. Now we have to choose our battles, and we have to choose when we decide to smile and let it go, and when we decide to actually press charges in some cases, right? Report things in order to really protect other people that could be in that person's harm's way. If you have someone that's being a jerk or that's being a little rude to you, then it's best to just be the bigger person and to smile and to let it go. If you have someone that's threatening you or that's putting you in a compromising situation, then it's better, especially in a climate like this, to show a stance of dignity and strength, not to become foul, not to do anything un-Islamic, but to show a position of dignity and strength, so that those Islamophobes are not further enabled to carry out that discrimination, not just against Muslims, but against anybody. And consider your environment, right? How vulnerable are you in that situation? So consider your vulnerability, consider your environment, and consider the effectiveness of your response. So I don't think that there's an absolute that there's an absolute way to deal with this. I do believe it's a judgment call every time. And I think first and foremost, your safety and your vulnerability should be considered. So if someone yells at you and you're alone and you're in a compromising situation, you yell back and that could get you hurt, then obviously you need to consider that. But if it's a situation where you feel safe, you feel protected. There was a sister, for example, that pulled out her cell phone and was recording a man berating her in a cafe, and that meant something, right? And showing some dignity, some strength. It's dignity and strength to respond with grace as well. But what I mean by strength here, I mean basically, we're not going to be bullied by you. She didn't curse. She didn't use the same foul language that he used. But it was the language that bullies need to hear sometimes, which is that we are not intimidated by you. So sometimes it's important to respond to intimidation with strength, in that you basically show that you will not be bullied and you will not be threatened or intimidated. But again, you have a jerk, you have someone that's dealing with you, in a certain way that's not showing you the best of manners. And don't let people with bad character teach you bad character. You teach them good character. That's it. Respond to that which is evil with that which is better. So respond with grace, inshallah ta'ala, and that's better for you in that situation. All right. Am I planning to come to Turkey soon? Inshallah, I hope so. Should I go to Hajj this year if I'm a green card holder? Yes, inshallah, but check with your care chapter or legal advice first. All right, a lot of these questions are not in any way related. Okay. No offense, guys, but I just want to keep I want to keep the Q&A focused, inshallah. All right. When you're constantly insulted by enemies or even family, where do you get your sense of self-worth from? Look, you have to, as much as you can, be able to bear, people being rude with you. There are different levels of insult and different levels of enmity that are shown. Harm should not be accepted. So you should not accept harm for yourself. You should never enable an abuser. But where do you get your self-worth from? Your sense of self-worth has to come from a deep internal place, deep in the heart, where you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who created you, and Allah is the one who assigns value to you. So your value as a person should come from your sense of belief and how you cling to that covenant with God. I think that's an important, consideration. And there are different levels of insult. So, but again, your sense of self-worth should come first and foremost from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, so I just got a message. Jazakallah khair. CLCMA is not recommending green card holders to go for Hajj. Okay, fine. I take that back. All right, so speak to an attorney and make that decision, inshallah. But may Allah reward you for your intention regardless. All right, last one. How to control emotions if someone uses foul language about our Prophet ﷺ and Islam. It is very hard to control our emotions. Please advise. Jazakumullah khair. That's a good question to end with, all right? When the Prophet ﷺ is insulted or people use foul language about Islam and the Messenger ﷺ, they are trying to put you in a place where you will prove their point about you and as Muslims being barbaric. When the Prophet ﷺ was insulted in Mecca, the goal was to make the Prophet ﷺ respond in like manner and to bring the Muslims to a point where they were just as foul and filthy as those who were oppressing them. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't fall for it, and that frustrated the people of Mecca. So when they called the Prophet ﷺ Mudhammam, which means the one who's humiliated, the Messenger ﷺ, that's his name. That's his name. He's being called Mudhammam instead of Muhammad. Muhammad is highly praised, Mudhammam is humiliated. And the Sahaba were infuriated. And the Prophet ﷺ told them, don't you see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is diverting their insults away from me? It's taking their insults away from me. They're insulting Mudhammam, and my name is Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So the Messenger ﷺ is teaching them not to let those people bring you to their level. So when they draw these cartoons, that's not our Prophet ﷺ. That image of this angry, ugly man with a bomb on his head, that's not our Prophet ﷺ. They can write the name Muhammad on it. That's not our Prophet ﷺ. We should not let ourselves be pulled into these things so that we can continue to be portrayed in a way that we deserve oppression, as an excuse for those that actually will oppress Muslims in a tangible way. So we respond with dignity, inshallah. We respond with showing who our Prophet ﷺ actually was and who he is, alayhi salatu wasalam, to us. And we always have to consider what's actually good for Islam and for the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam.